I was 9 years old the first time I realized there were questions you simply were not allowed to ask. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. I remember because the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs, and my mother and three of the older women from our church were sitting around the table talking in voices just low. Enough that I could not quite make out the words. I walked in to ask for a glass of water, and the room went quiet, not slowly, all at once, like someone had lifted a needle off a record. The women looked at each other, and my mother looked at me, and without saying a single word, she tilted her head toward the door. I left without the water. I never asked what they had been talking about, but I never forgot that silence either, because that was the day I understood that some truths in our world were kept behind a closed door and children were not given the key. My name is Hannah. I grew up in an Old Order Amish community in rural Ohio, and I lived inside that world for the first 22 years of my life. I wore the white prayer covering every single day. I spoke Pennsylvania Dutch at home and English only when necessary. I churned butter, I harvested gardens, I sat through 3-hour church services on wooden benches in neighbors' barns every other Sunday. I did not own a mirror large enough to see my full reflection. I did not listen to music with instruments. I did not question the Ordnung, which is the unwritten code of rules that governed everything: what we wore, how we traveled, who we married, and what we were permitted to feel. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that, but I was kept. And there is a difference between a life that is peaceful and a life that is simply never allowed to be anything else. I am telling you all of this because today I am going to answer the question that thousands of people type into search bars, but that almost no one from my world would ever answer openly, but to answer it honestly. You first need to understand the world it comes from. What they taught us about the body was simple: cover it, control it, do not speak of it. From the time I was old enough to dress myself, I understood that modesty was not just a rule, it was a sign of character. A girl who covered herself properly was a girl who respected God, her family, and her future husband. A girl who did not was something else entirely, and no one needed to say what that something else was. We all understood. That understanding was passed down not through conversations, but through silence, through looks, through the way a woman's voice would drop mid-sentence if a young girl wandered too close. I remember being 13 years old, sitting in a circle of women during a quilting afternoon. The older women were talking, and for a moment I caught pieces of a conversation about a young wife in a neighboring district. I did not understand all of it, but I heard enough to know it involved something private between her and her husband. Within seconds, one of the women noticed me listening, and the conversation dissolved completely. Someone asked me to fetch more thread. I went. Nobody acknowledged what had just happened, but I felt it. I felt the wall go up, and I understood that I was on the wrong side of it. That was how we learned, not from words, but from erasure. We were taught that the body existed for work, for childbearing, and for the service of the household. Intimacy was mentioned only in the context of marriage, and even then it was framed purely as purpose. And duty, pleasure was a word that did not exist in our vocabulary. Desire was something to be suppressed before it could even be named. And curiosity, the very thing that makes us human, was treated as the first step toward something shameful. When I turned 16, I entered Rumspringa. People outside our world often imagine this as a season of rebellion, of teenagers disappearing into cities and coming back changed. In my community, it was nothing like that. It was simply a small loosening of the rope. Sunday evening singings, young people gathered in someone's barn, hymns, followed by quiet conversation and the slow, careful process of pairing off. That was where I met Eli. He was tall and steady, and he made me feel noticed in a way I had no language for yet. We courted for nearly 2 years. In all that time, we were never permitted to be alone in a room together. We spoke at gatherings. We exchanged a few careful letters. Once, walking back from a singing in the dark, he reached out and held my hand, and I let him, and I spent the next 3 days carrying the weight of that moment like something I had stolen. When he kissed me for the first time, just once, just briefly, outside his family's fence. I felt something open up inside me that I did not know how to close. I told my mother, not because I wanted to, because the guilt made it impossible not to. She was not angry. She simply told me that those feelings were natural, but that they belonged inside marriage, and that everything I was feeling would find its proper place once I had a husband. I held on to those words like a promise. Everyone told me that once I was married, everything would make sense. I believed them. I had no reason not to. Eli and I married in the spring. There were no rings, no photographs, no honeymoon. Our wedding was held in his family's home, 300 people seated on wooden benches, 2.5 hours of hymns and scripture and the quiet exchange of vows. By evening it was over, and we were alone together for the first time in 2 years of knowing each other. The house was small. His father and brothers had built it the previous autumn on a corner of the family property. There was a wood stove, a bed, a window that looked out over a dark field. I remember standing in that room and feeling a kind of fear that had nothing to do with Eli and everything to do with how completely unprepared I was. No one had told me what to expect. Not really. I knew the basics of reproduction the way you know the basics of anything you have been taught in purely functional terms. But no one had told me that it would feel like something. No one had told me that closeness had a texture, that vulnerability had a physical weight, that two people could share something that went so far beyond biology that it left you quietly undone. And that was where the confusion began, because what I felt that night was real. It was warm and human and it mattered. But I had been taught that this was duty, that it was purpose, that it was a means to an end that God had sanctioned. And so I lay there afterward in the dark and asked myself a question I did not dare say out loud. Was I allowed to have enjoyed that? Was there something wrong with me for feeling more than I was supposed to feel? I did not have an answer, and there was no one I could ask. In the months that followed, I began to pay attention in a different way. I watched the older women at fellowship meals, the ones who had been married for 20 and 30 years, and I started to notice things I had never seen before. The way a wife would set a plate in front of her husband and let her hand rest on his shoulder just a half second longer than necessary. The way certain couples would share a look across a crowded room that carried an entire conversation inside it. The way some marriages seemed to hold a warmth that went beyond partnership and duty, something quieter and more private that existed between two people and belonged to no one else. I realized that what I had been taught and what was actually happening were not entirely the same thing. The silence was not evidence of absence. It was a container, and inside that container, behind all the modesty and the rules and the carefully managed surfaces, there was something very human taking place. It was my neighbor Ruth who finally gave me the words for it. Ruth was in her 50s, had been married for 30 years, and had a steadiness about her that I had always admired. One afternoon, while we were preserving tomatoes together, I worked up the courage to ask her whether it was wrong to feel close to your husband in a way that went beyond what the church described. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said that God did not create marriage to be an empty obligation. She said that joy between a husband and wife was not sinful as long as it remained humble and did not become the center of everything. She said the church taught restraint, yes, but restraint was not the same as emptiness. It was the first honest answer anyone had ever given me. And yes, to answer the question you came here with, Amish people do experience pleasure in marriage, but it looks nothing like what the outside world imagines. It is quieter, it is private, and it is wrapped in a lifetime of silence that makes it both more fragile and more sacred than most people will ever understand. I left the community for years after that conversation with Ruth. I want to be careful about how I say this because leaving is not a simple thing and it is not a heroic thing. It is a grief. You do not walk away from the only world you have ever known and feel free. You feel lost. You feel guilty. You feel the absence of everything familiar pressing against you from every direction at once. The outside world was louder than I had imagined, not just in terms of sound, but in terms of how openly everything was displayed. Intimacy was everywhere, in advertisements, in television shows, in the way strangers talked about their relationships without flinching. And my first reaction was not liberation. It was discomfort, because there was something in all that openness that felt careless to me, like something that should have been held gently was being handled without care. But I stayed, and slowly, carefully, I began the long work of unlearning the shame that had attached itself to my own body. Unlearning the belief that wanting closeness made me weak or sinful or less than what I was supposed to be. I had to rebuild my understanding of intimacy from the ground up, and that process was neither fast nor clean. It required honesty with myself that I had never been permitted to practice before. It required sitting with feelings I had spent my whole life being taught to suppress and learning slowly that they did not make me dangerous. They made me human. What I understand now, after everything, is this. No matter where you come from, you are navigating the same tension between what you were taught and what you truly need, between duty and desire, between the role you were given and the person you actually are. The Amish are not so different from anyone else in that way. They just do it more quietly. And perhaps that is something worth sitting with, regardless of whether you have ever worn a prayer covering or spoken a word of Pennsylvania Dutch in your life. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever carried a question you were not allowed to ask, or felt something you were not permitted to name, I want you to know that you are not alone in that. Leave a comment, share what you are carrying, because understanding begins when someone is finally willing to speak first. And today, that someone was me.